From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everyone. This is sponsored by Science, Technology, and Business Division. I'm Tomoko Steen. I'm a research specialist at the library's Science, Technology, and Business Division. Today's speaker is cybersecurity discussion. It's going to be very interesting. He is Professor Jean-Pierre Auffret at George Mason University. And he's a director of research partnership in the School of Business and also associate director of the Center for Assurance Research and Engineering in the School of Engineering. He's currently also visiting lecturer at Duke Sanford School of Public Policy. He has a PhD in physics and also MBA from University of Virginia, and his PhD is from American University. He has a chemistry undergraduate degree from Duke University. Cybersecurity is really close to our lives, and from communication to medical research, and also the medical devices are now, cybersecurity really involved. So before further ado, please join me welcoming Professor Auffret.
Thank you, Tomoko, and thank you all for joining today. It's a real pleasure to visit the Library of Congress again and to meet all of you. Sorry. Just real quickly, the main focus of the talk is both domestically and internationally what some of the challenges and innovations and approaches are to cybersecurity. As part of that, I'm going to start with a little bit of background and context, both on the changing technology landscape, but also changing cybersecurity landscape, and then wrap up with international relations and some on future trends. A little bit of background of our Cybersecurity Center. We're a research to practice center and have a range of technical projects and policy projects, as well as leadership and governance. So some of the current ones we have, I have two projects with DARPA, one on distributed denial of service and one on Internet of Things, trying to ascertain whether a device has been compromised by change in the electromagnetic field or power consumption. And then had a recent project with IBM on smart grid, and then two projects, leadership and governance with National Science Foundation, one on developing core competencies for chief information security officers, and a new one working with cities and counties across the country on fostering cybersecurity partnering amongst cities and counties. The idea being that many cities and counties are relatively small and have limited expertise and budgets, and there's a great potential for them partnering together. So some background, I think, on the landscape and the technology landscape. I think these two are circumstances are really quite amazing and illustrate that the increasing importance of technology in day-to-day lives and in society. The one on the upper left is the digital identity in India. So the Indian government has a Digital India program, and about 5 years ago undertook a program to provide everyone in the country over the age of 5 with a digital identity. So part of the motivation is 80% of India lives in rural areas, and with 1.3 billion people total, it's about 1 billion people. So it would make it one of the biggest countries in the world, just the rural areas. And many of those in the rural areas did not have identities, driver's license or another type of government identity. And in fact, many of the women's identities were through their husband, and they didn't have their own actual identity. And so as a way of fostering economic growth, partially also to address corruption, the Indian government undertook this program. So it's a quite large challenge to provide unique identities to 1 billion people. And so the way they did it was with iris scans and taking 10 fingerprints. And the program has since broadened. So not just for identity, the Indian government now trying to replace paper currency with digital currency, also using this Aadhaar card for mobile SIM chips, really becoming more and more a part of society. Of course, there's issues and challenges with cybersecurity and privacy, but the Indian government sees it as a way to really catalyze the country in the coming years. And then on the bottom right, Estonia, considered the most digital country in the world. Really kind of interesting. They only had a few years of independence for the last 700 years until the early 1990s. In the 1920s, and if you go to the Estonian embassy, there's a letter welcoming I believe by Calvin Coolidge, welcoming the Estonian ambassador to the U.S. for that short number of years. But after they became independent, they really tried to develop an IT industry. They had a history of computer science from the Soviet years, and Microsoft chose them as a test bed for new products. And so the Estonian government developed a consensus that they were going to compete as a small country in the ICT space. That they digitized the government for the most part, founded Skype and now a number of other companies, but really totally reliant on ICT. And also totally reliant on cybersecurity. So those are two examples where more and more so in the world. I think ITU puts out wonderful reports every year measuring the information society. This is from last year, I believe. Really remarkable, though, the blue line on the upper part is mobile phone adoption. Oh, I'm sorry. That the orange line is mobile phone adoption. And so pretty much 100 subscriptions per 100 people around the world, even in rural areas in developing countries. So that the cell phone has tremendous power and more like a computer. One other interesting note on the slide, that the dark green one is mobile broadband adoption, and that's even faster than mobile phone adoption. So more and more countries have industries with mobile banking, such as M-Pesa and Kenya. And the motivation for that is a country might have 20 or 30% of the country has a population has a bank account. 90 or 100% have cell phones. So the cell phone providing an avenue for banking and other services. Here too, this is just in the last number of years. Only recently, the last 10 years or so, did submarine cables land in West Africa, and East Africa was just a little bit before that. A follow-on to that, many countries are now developing fiber backbone networks in Africa. With that, the cost of cell phone and availability coming down rapidly, and the country becoming more and more reliant on IT and at risk from cybersecurity. Just a little background on what's driving the technology change, and in the areas of computer storage, processing speed, and transmission speed. And these trends continue. So it was just in 1980 that the first 1 gigabyte of storage became commercially available. And it was about the size of a refrigerator, weighed 550 pounds, and cost $40,000. So today we can all go to a micro center and buy several terabytes for $50. So that trend continuing. Similarly with transmission, only in 1957 the first transatlantic cable, and only 36 or so simultaneous phone calls for many dollars a minute. Today, 3 or 4 million calls on a fiber optic cable, and that trend continuing too. And lastly, processing speed. By coincidence, the first Apple computer, as well as the first lunar lander, both had processing speeds of about 2,000 cycles a second, now 6, 7, 8 billion cycles a second. So as much as technology has changed over the last 30 years today, hard to imagine with these trends continuing where it'll be in 10, 20, or 30 years, and there too what the cyber risks are. Of course, much written and much being done on the Sustainable Development Goals, and some really interesting work and many interesting initiatives on the role of ICT in all of these, but also too the risk of cyber attack and the importance of cybersecurity. One of the more interesting initiatives, I think, is Japan's Society 5.0, partially to address demographic trends in society or decreasing population, also to stay competitive, but Japan looking to embed even more so ICT and all the infrastructure and their approach to all areas of society. So Japan with a very large focus on ICT, but a very large focus on cybersecurity too. And then lastly, on some of the main challenges and issues, this is a World Economic Forum report, I believe. Yeah, World Economic Forum report. And so it's not all about the technology. The left-hand side has institutional capacity, and across the bottom has technology capacity. And you can see the countries fall in different sides of the 45-degree line. Some countries much stronger and have much more developed institutional capacity, like legal frameworks and ICT governance and ICT leadership in government, privacy policy. Others are much stronger in technology and a little bit less developed in ICT governance and ICT frameworks. And then some countries are doing quite well in both. But ultimately, though, it takes both, the ICT governance and the legislative framework and the policy framework and the cybersecurity and the trust, as well as the technology. Some of the changes from a legal standpoint and a risk standpoint for cybersecurity and understanding the risks to governments and countries. Everyone recognizes that the anonymous mask, really quite an active organization, and some say that one of the first or the first non-country country actually. But they provide a threat to many types of countries as well as local governments. From where I'm from in South Florida, the Fort Lauderdale government passed legislation on loitering. It had to do with homeless, but they were trying to help the homeless, but also passed this anti-loitering legislation. And Anonymous actually defaced their website, also too attacking many of the pharmaceutical companies and larger firms. The risk on the bottom right of the insider, we'll talk about this a little bit later, not in the context of Edward Snowden, but in the context of differing perceptions of cybersecurity from country to country. The upper left was one of a conviction by the U.S. government, Department of Justice. This gentleman led a ring in Estonia, as it turns out, on click-through fraud. And so they made tens of millions of dollars. And the chart there shows that the companies that they bought with the proceeds from the click-through fraud that they had. And then the bottom left, the Chinese group who attacked some of our companies, Westinghouse, U.S. Steel, and cyber espionage, industrial espionage. And we'll talk about that too in different perceptions in a little bit. And then lastly, this is a current one. You can see the quite large award or reward, $1 million offered by the FBI. This gentleman was running fraudulent car auctions here. He lived overseas, but here. And so people were buying cars online and paying for the cars, but there was ultimately no car. And so the U.S. government, he's one of the most wanted, the cyber most wanted by the FBI. So a lot of risk to citizens and a lot of risk to critical infrastructure. Last year, a topic that was in the news a lot is the risk to the electric grid. So the electric grid is changing. So previously, or over the years, it was one directional, power flowing one way. It wasn't very IT reliant. It had industrial control systems with many years of life, not connected to networks or to the internet. Now the power system is different. So power goes two ways, both from the power company to the users, and then also for those with solar power back to the power company. Also more and more reliant on information technology. So this example from Russian territory, part of the Ukrainian power grid was shut down for about 3 hours or so. And it was of interest both primarily because of it was demonstrating that someone could indeed take down a power company. Part of the sophistication of this was that it was planned in the reconnaissance that it took. Part of it wasn't that sophisticated, more the click-through type of thing. but that the U.S. government very oriented towards the risks to the power system as well as to the risk to much of our critical infrastructure. One of the kind of interesting things about the U.S. Is both our distributed governance as well as distributed approach to critical infrastructure. So in the U.S. we have 50,000 or so water companies, more than 3,000 electric utilities. Many are very, very big and very sophisticated. Many are much, much smaller. Oftentimes they're municipal owned. And then there's a national government responsibility as well as state government from public service commissions. So part of the challenge here in the U.S. is how all these things come together. Part of the other challenge is the technology itself, sometimes with operating systems in Windows, sometimes with flash drives, sometimes at the banks adopting new technology, and sometimes, as I mentioned, with the electric grid. This is an interesting demonstration, which was going to show, but not using my computer. Has anyone seen the Aurora demonstration from Idaho National Lab? So it's a demonstration of the connection between physical security and internet security. And part of the motivation for the Japan Society 5.0 is the increasing convergence of physical and cyber and internet. But what this demonstration was in 2007, and this is a CNN video, is by online rapidly opening and closing the relays out of phase with the electric grid, they were able to cause this to start shaking slowly and ultimately end up smoking like that. So it was a very visual demonstration, and part of the objective was to do something visual. But the point being that there's this connection between physical and cyber, and it's becoming more and more relevant. So right before, we were talking a little bit about drones. So there's a connection. Many of the drones operated from ground, and the drone flying. Autonomous vehicles such as cars, robots and robotics, and even artificial intelligence, all of these things with more autonomy and oftentimes a physical aspect to them. Okay, what makes the threat so, part of what makes the threat so challenging is the asymmetry of it. So the systems that we have today are really complicated, millions and millions of lines of code, often a mix of custom code and some open source, some legacy code. And contrast that oftentimes malware can be as small as 125 lines. So relatively easy to duplicate, relatively easy to sell, non-sophisticated types. But really a contrast with the systems that we have. This is a DARPA slide to try to demonstrate the asymmetry or the advantage sometimes with today's technology that an attacker might have. So the questions for the country and for a company and for an individual too is how secure actually are you as a company or as an government or as a home, a house, or a family, and how do you answer that, which is difficult because it's a risk issue. Are we more secure this year than last year, and how do we know? And how much more secure would we be if we spent so much extra in budget dollars? And how much more secure would we be if we adopt these processes, practices, and technologies? So these are difficult questions to answer, and that's part of the challenge or objective with IT governance, is to develop a way or to have an approach within a company or a government to answer these types of questions. And then the answers to these types of questions lead to the cybersecurity plan or program for the year and the budget and the initiatives. So a country's overall cybersecurity strategy, much, much broader than this, but at the company level, this is a big part of it. So and part of answering that is to look at what the actual cost is to a company. And there's two types. So there's the type of cost that there might be for a critical infrastructure breach, and then there's more the financial costs from a personal type information breach. But let's look at one example from Wyndham Worldwide. and see what the direct and indirect costs are. So Wyndham owns Ramada, I think, and I think Days Inn and some other ones, very big hotel chain, and quite a good one. So they had a major breach about 2010 or so with the theft of millions of credit cards. So a major breach, not as big as some, but quite big. And so there was the cost to the consumer of the monitoring, which they covered, but also the costs for whoever lost identity loss. But also that there was many other costs to the company. So the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S. Has a very large cybersecurity role, and it derives from fair trade practices. And so and also how you present yourself to your customers, whether you're truthful in presenting yourself. So they've had dozens of actions, some of which have been that companies haven't been upfront about what they're doing with data or what cyber risks they have. But in this case, there was a theft of personal information, and so the FTC sent a request to Wyndham Worldwide to provide information. Over the several years, so Wyndham Worldwide provided over 1,000 pages of documentation. So it affected, through the burden of answering the questions, the company operations. Ultimately, FTC filed a lawsuit, which they settled. So just with the FTC, a large amount of costs. But Wyndham at this point isn't complete with the FTC. So the FTC now has oversight on Wyndham systems for 20 years. Wyndham has to provide reporting annually into the FTC about how they're providing cybersecurity and how they know. But also, Wyndham ended up with lawsuits from state attorney generals and a shareholder derivative lawsuit, which was ultimately dismissed. But shareholders asking the company, and the company wouldn't or didn't, to sue executives for not performing their cybersecurity responsibilities. So Target 2, class action settlement, paying the banks also, not just the cardholders. Another one, this was, the shareholder, Home Depot shareholder derivative suit. So a number of very large costs. So the companies developing a cybersecurity strategy, but also developing policies and procedures to protect the customers, to protect their employees, protect their operations, but also more and more the risk from Federal Trade Commission and other government agencies who have oversight responsibility. So these agencies, to some extent, driving cybersecurity posture of our companies. Okay, so what are the company's key assets, and how does a company go about developing a cybersecurity program? One of the best ways I've seen, a gentleman who's been CISO at a major bank and a major power company and now at a major pharmaceutical company, is to develop a consensus amongst the executives as to what the key assets are within the company, key information assets. So much different in the power company than in the pharmaceutical company, the intellectual property as well as the personal information, the power company, the control systems and the like, as well as the financials. But to develop a consensus across the organization as to what the key information assets are, what the risks they face, and then how to go about protecting them and what budget dollars do they need. Another thing he also does is have a external assessment of the cybersecurity. And he's evolved it, and so now he partners with companies from other industries, has someone come in to assess them on a number of attributes, and then does a comparison across all the companies, and it gives him leverage with the board. But you can see some of the assets here. A plane schematic on the bottom right, which was actually stolen by the Chinese. Upper left, credit card information, and the bottom left, power company. So this is some of the elements that this company has benchmarked against others. So a lot of it is leadership and governance. So policies, their organization, HR security, Some of it's technology, cryptography, communication security, and then some of it is compliance and incident management. One of the new ones that many companies are taking up, partially post-Target, is supplier relationships, including many of the larger companies here in Washington. So going back, reviewing their existing contracts, the ones with the largest vendors that might place them at most risk from cybersecurity, and where possible, renegotiating part of it, and setting up a process for any new contract if it exceeds some threshold of cyber risk that the CISO signs off on it. And then this is how they organize. So this is a 100,000 person company, quite distributed around the world. But you can see it's not strategy and architecture, enterprise risk, privacy, incident response, and third party are the main part. And then kind of interestingly, and I think different than many companies, although there's more and more doing it this way, the actual day-to-day technology part of cybersecurity, like managing firewalls and the like, is done by the CIO, the Information Technology Group. So this group, much more strategic and much more engaged with the board. And it's what this gentleman did at the very large bank and the power company, too. So I think this is a really good approach at a company level to how to go about it. Did anyone read the Inspector General's report on OPM, the OPM aftermath? It actually reads like a roadmap for the Chinese, unfortunately. But it talks about a lot of these types of things, so that the not having a CISO, the cybersecurity staff that was at OPM not being very elevated and being able to connect with executives, not having two-factor authentication. So a lot of the things which are good practices can go a long way towards strengthening cybersecurity. Okay, one of the more important things I think, is leadership in cybersecurity and really elevating the role, especially in where it's possible in larger organizations. So we're working with the cities and counties. We had a workshop for Virginia, and so many of the Virginia cities and counties are quite small and oftentimes don't have a cybersecurity executive, and sometimes too don't even have a IT staff person. So there's the size is really, really important. But for the larger organizations, the leadership is integral. So in the U.S. itself has a quite long focus on elevating the role of the CIO, and this is international too. Many countries now have national ICT plans, and many countries have either legislation or policy requiring a CIO in government ministries or agencies. And some of the legislation goes so far as to require CIO in private sector companies, like Japan's does. And we'll see this being adopted in cybersecurity. So in the US, our first act was in the late 1990s, the Klinger-Cohen Act, which required a CIO in government agencies, and also established the Federal CIO Council for coordinating IT across government agencies on issues of commonalities such as cybersecurity and enterprise architecture and human capacity building. Over the years, the role didn't necessarily turn out as envisioned. And in some agencies, the CIO didn't have budget authority, or in some agencies, there's multiple CIOs who didn't necessarily all report up to the main CIO. So Commerce is a good example of this. So Commerce, a wonderful agency with does fantastic work in multiple organizations within it, such as NOAA and Patent and Trademark and NIST. Some of those receive their budget through user fees and have some degree of autonomy. So within Commerce, the NOAA CIO and the Patent and Trademark over the years, not necessarily reporting into the Commerce CIO. So this being a way to strengthen CIO leadership in government. More and more organizations and government agencies, and this is worldwide too, elevating the role of Chief Information Security Officer to a peer level with CIO. It varies by industry and it varies by degree of cybersecurity maturity. It varies by size of the organization. So that the gentleman from the pharmaceutical company, he's a peer of the CIO and a peer of the CFO, the CISO role. In county and state government, it varies. In Arlington County, the CISO reports to the CIO. In other counties, that isn't so. They're more of a peer. There can be a conflict that the CIO oriented towards developing services quickly and customer service and product delivery, the CISO for security, but it can work both ways, but there can be a conflict. This is a project we did through National Science Foundation. We interviewed executives across the country, cyber and IT, as well as other executives in regard to the core competencies for the most important core competencies for chief information security officers, and talked to both government and private sector and local, state, and national government. And we organized them by perspectives. And as you can see here too, as with the CIO and as with the large company, many of these are non-technical. So leading large organizations, building high-performance teams, compliance, communications being at the top. One interesting thing, we had a question, do you think technology knowledge is as important or more important than leadership and leadership background and communications? And the overwhelming answer was that they're both, for a CISO, equally important. That some technology and technology knowledge, an ability to communicate about technology both to staff as well as boards, as well as leadership being quite important. That was part of the report. So what are countries doing then for cybersecurity strategy, and what are the ramifications for international relations? According to ITU, about 75 countries now have cybersecurity strategies and policies. Although on their website, some of them are quite old or dated. But about 75 countries, about 90% of countries have national ICT policies and strategies. So a subset having cybersecurity policies and strategies. But mostly they follow along and address some of the topics of this one from Singapore. So Singapore is similar to Estonia, competing on IT and oriented towards being a smart society. So some of their major initiatives are hardening security, developing the workforce, working internationally, which we'll talk about, and public outreach and awareness. So many of the types of things, or a subset of the types of things that we do here, or that are really important to us. Countries compete on cybersecurity. So Korea has as an objective of its industrial strategy being a world leader in Internet of Things and developing a vibrant Korean Internet of Things ecosystem. One of the pillars of that strategy is IoT security. So becoming a world leader in IoT security as a means to become a world leader in IoT. Here's kind of, it's really quite small, but as with ICT national plans, evolution of plans and strategies over the years. This is Singapore's, but we've had something similar here. So we have had an evolution of national plans and strategies. One major difference to highlight, I think, is the difference in well, size, obviously, and national geography, but also the difference in our approach to government, which derives somewhat from our size. So we have the municipal, the state, and the national, much different than a Singapore, which is one government. So here we have the national approach with the roles of FBI, DHS, and Director of National Intelligence. There's state roles, and then there's also the roles of local and municipal government and cybersecurity, and then those coming together. One other interesting aside on the differences that we have, so the states many of the electric companies and water companies are municipal owned, but also all of them are licensed through the state public service commissions. So state public service commissions beginning to take a role in cybersecurity and overseeing the industries and companies that they regulate. But it's really kind of remarkable how these public service commissions differ across the country, both in their makeup and how they come to be and in their mission. So in some states, they're appointed. In some states, they're elected statewide. In some states, they're elected in the regions. In some states, the mission is real narrow. And in Mississippi, for example, the role of the Public Service Commission, one of the prime roles, is to foster economic development. So really very, very different across the country as they look to take a cyber role. Connecticut now requires annual reports from Connecticut Public Service Commission from their companies that they regulate in an annual meeting with the Service Commission. Others are different stages. So as I said, many countries have policies. These are just three, the UK, Chile, and on the left, Japan. A lot of commonality, but also some differences in approach and differences in emphasis, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we compare U.S. and China, or talk about the U.S.-China relationship. Just on the role of the CIO, for example, so as I mentioned, the Japanese law for CIO requires private sector companies to have them. About 2 years ago, Korea, through legislation, started requiring CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, in financial companies over a certain size. So different than here, although here in the US now, state of New York requires CISOs in financial services companies over a certain size. So again, regulation really driving a lot of this. ITU helping countries, developing countries, develop national cybersecurity strategies, and here's the elements. Number one is similar to private sector companies and boards, having an engagement and accountability by the board. Having a coordinator, having a focal point, legal framework for cybersecurity, including on cybercrime and trust, incident response for the country, awareness and education, building on public-private partnerships, skills and training and cooperation. Singapore, for example, has one other one that's not on this one from ITU, which is innovation. So Singapore looking to compete in the cybersecurity industry and wanting to be an innovator in that. But so many of the countries working with ITU taking this approach. We had a Humphrey Fellow visitor last year for 6 weeks from Nigeria, from OAU University. And he was working on a project. So Nigeria just recently passed a Cybersecurity Act. But their challenge, as many of developing countries, they don't have the institutional foundation to implement something like that readily. So the project he was working on was to develop the strengthening institutions so they can actually implement the act they have. And their university also a World Bank Center of Excellence for cyber in West Africa. Okay, some of the trends, I think, some are technology and then some are policy and international. One is the role of artificial intelligence and big data. So the systems and the network elements are generating millions or actually billions of data instances and alerts, and it's impossible to hire enough staff to look at all of these. So the path is artificial intelligence and being able to analyze a lot of the cyber data computationally, becoming less reliant on analysts and using analysts for the really things that need a lot of expertise. So the schools have many cyber students, but just the demand is much too great. Also, too, for example, smaller companies can't afford a cyber analyst, or smaller water companies. So automation being really important and a big part of the path forward. Also on technology, and I don't have it, but I think the interaction of hardware and software, like some of the companies are working on, such as Intel and ARM with their Trustonic, but many others too, Samsung, building part of the security into the hardware is part of an important part of the path forward too. Another part is international cooperation at the multilateral level, and then we'll wrap up with the bilateral level. So many fantastic initiatives worldwide. The bottom right highlights a challenge of cybersecurity in general. So countries have different perceptions of what cybersecurity is and what the internet is. Amongst each other, it varies somewhat east and west, somewhat developed and developing, somewhat even amongst neighbors at much different perceptions. There's also different perceptions on governance of the internet, which comes into play too. The U.S. having a central role since the start of it, but many countries, and tying into the view of cybersecurity, thinking that the role should be more distributed. This is a wonderful book on the bottom right. So in Estonia, there's a NATO Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and they put out a first version of this manual. It's by academics. It's not non-binding. The first one was on cyber war, but this is more on day-to-day cyber operations and things like sovereignty. And they go through issue by issue, and they talk about issues where there's a consensus amongst all the experts, including from US and Russia and China and Europe and South America and Africa and Asia, but also where there's just disagreement amongst the experts and not a consensus. About 10 years ago, or a little bit longer, the ITU wanted to, the secretary of the ITU wanted to undertake a cybersecurity project amongst the ITU membership. The ITU has done a lot more on cyber since, but he wanted to come up with a non-controversial project that all the members could participate in. And the only one that he was able to get an agreement that he thought he could get a consensus on was on pedophiles, online predators. So that was the one where there was a consensus amongst all countries on what it was and the risks. But it's not just NATO. So APEC has an active cyber program. World Bank funding World Bank centers of excellence. OECD is doing quite a lot. European Union, United Nations. So the international community quite active in it. And part of it is technology innovation, but part of it is strengthening the institutional capacity of the countries. Part of it too is security by design, so that software and devices, as they are taken to the market, are secure and not in as much risk. So part of the challenge of this is differing motivations and who actually pays and economic disincentives. So if you're producing a device and it's very low margin and you need to get it into the market, and you're not going to bear the cost of a cybersecurity breach, for example, if it's taken over for a DDoS attack, your motivation isn't necessarily into putting a lot of security on it. So aligning economic motivations with the technology development, a big case too. A better example of that, I think, is electronic medical records. It's similar economic incentives. So pretty much everyone agrees there's a public good if everyone had a portable electronic medical record. You're able to go from doctor to doctor or hospital to hospital. But there's multiple stakeholders, and there's not enough incentive or motivation for any one stakeholder to fund it over the years. So not necessarily an incentive for the hospitals. It's different now with the government, the government payment system. Not incentive for the hospitals. Insurance companies have a motivation, but can't carry the day for having it implemented. The patients like it, but not necessarily going to pay for it. And so that's part of the background of why we don't have it here. So our government, 2009, part of the Affordable Care Act, implemented that you would get a bonus if you implemented them on Medicare and Medicaid, and over time a penalty. So the government using positive and negative incentives to try to drive behavior. But over time, security by design multilateral security agreements. So European Union, for example, looking at digital Europe and harmonizing some of the approaches to cyber across the countries. Really an important initiative. And then lastly, bilateral ones. My point, though, in wrapping up with this one is not so much to highlight the agreement. This was from 2015, the two presidents, but to highlight the differences in point of view. So the agreement itself was this. So this was right after the 5, I believe it was, Chinese military were indicted in Pennsylvania for hacking into industrial espionage for Westinghouse and U.S. Steel. So shortly after the indictment, there was the meeting between President Obama and President Xi, and they had this agreement. So timely coordination, cooperating in a manner consistent with national laws. Neither country's government will support cyber theft of IP, which was new, and both sides making a common effort. But the background to this is that historically there's been differences in the view of what espionage is between the two countries, and also differences in the view of how the internet should be governed. So the Chinese view historically has been espionage under a broad umbrella, and so industrial espionage just part of overall national espionage, and something a country does to strengthen its national position or national competitiveness. And so our view, a little bit different historically, that there's national espionage that we do, but that industrial espionage is separate and not sanctioned internationally. So that's a very broad divide between the two. And even within our definition, that the OPM one may well be considered espionage under a U.S. view, but the industrial ones with Westinghouse and U.S. Steel not. So this agreement, to the extent it is followed, actually China agreeing that IP may well, type of espionage may well be different. So these types of agreements have potential too, that cybersecurity being part of a real broad umbrella internationally and part of international relations. Ultimately, though, it's the intersection of better systems and better technology and innovation in cybersecurity, along with increased cybersecurity leadership and governance, policy and legislation, which will come together to make the world safer from a cyber perspective. So I hope that was somewhat interesting. And if anyone has any questions, that would be great. Yes.
I was reading about quantum computing
Oh,
and the threat it will be maybe in 8 years to encryption systems.
So the that with quantum computing that there's some risk that our current encryption approaches will become obsolete quite quickly. Yeah, there is a view that there's that risk. And NIST has a program now for developing encryption algorithms that would work in a quantum computing world. So the U.S. government is concerned, as demonstrated through the research they're funding. I think too, this is from very far away, that Chinese government seems to be advancing quite rapidly in quantum communications with the satellite they have and quantum computing. And so I think probably from our standpoint, we would do well with further investment or focus on it. But it's an important area, I think. Oh, yes.
There's a lot of talk about the shortage of qualified cybersecurity professionals, especially for the purpose of the federal government. They can't afford to pay them comparative wages. Are there some recommendations that you have for what the federal government can do to invest better and more strategically in improving the cybersecurity workforce?
Oh, I think there's quite a few things. I think part of it is external, and then part of it's internal. So the government has some fantastic programs working with universities to foster, enhance education, cybersecurity education, and also increase the number of students going into cybersecurity, both in undergraduate and graduate, and increasingly K through 12. And so I think that the universities are both training and educating a fair number of students. I don't think it'll ever be enough because of the issue with the technology. But then I think it's also somewhat difficult to join the government. So I think for students looking to join the government, there's fantastic programs for internships, which our students do. Many of our students have a challenge with the process, although many of the agencies are very helpful, but the long process. There's also the chicken and egg issue with the clearances. Can be a bit of a challenge. And then one other thing I've noticed in the very, very large ones, agencies, is career pathing. Some of the agencies are fantastic on career pathing in cyber, and some not so. So I can give two examples, not the name of the agency, but two examples. So one, a quite large agency that does fantastic things, but and this is hard everywhere in private sector companies too, struggling a little bit with technical versus managerial career paths, and how to keep somebody challenged and interested in on a advancing career path in the technical field, who really loves it and is really offering a lot, or how someone can try a managerial career path and then go back. And so that's hard in a consulting company too. So I think that's an example. In another company or agency, and this is one of the ones that does offensive too, and insider threat. And so their part of the issue is organizationally, where the cybersecurity group there's not much career advancement, and that the offensive is working with the more current technologies, and so everyone wants to gravitate towards that too. So I think it's a little bit working with the universities, and then a little bit to ease the way in, and then a little bit to the career pathing issue. What do you think?
I mean, I think yeah, I know there's a lot of talk about opening up some of the programs, like the cybercore program, I guess you're referring to, two-year institutions or even short-term programs. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, the cybercore one is fantastic, and I think connecting more towards with the community colleges would be great. The National Science Foundation, the core competency project that we had, that was a cybercore project. The community colleges, because they're training and working with the hands-on, so I think. Also, too, I think there's, many I've talked to, there's kind of mixed reviews of 18F and the U.S. Digital Service, but I think those types of initiatives have potential too for cybersecurity. Yes, I think all those.
Question
Oh.
medical devices. Any plan? Do you hear anything to manage the cybersecurity for the medical devices?
Yeah, the FDA is quite active. It's cybersecurity for medical devices. The FDA is quite active in it. It's a hard topic, I think, because part of with the approach to approvals. So if a device is similar, it has a rapid approval or an expedited approval path. But it's very difficult to say that software in one device is similar to software in another device. But the FDA is looking at enhanced regulation of medical devices according to the risk, obviously. And then also some testing approach for medical devices and medical device security. and also increased guidance on issues such as patching. So I think all of those, but it's a real challenging area. Everyone see some of the examples in the news over the last year or so that got highlighted with medical devices? I think the one that had the most news play was an infusion pump, the drip, where it was hacked and someone was able to turn it on and off remotely. They didn't do it, but they just demonstrated that it was possible. Actually, one of our master's degree programs, they have a capstone class project. They did a medical device project, and they tested heart monitors. They put it on themselves and were able to, some of them had no security on them. They were able to monitor someone's heart rate from like 100 yards away. So I think the manufacturers are getting better, but it's a big challenge. And it's a big challenge for the hospitals, too. I think the hospitals are going to drive a lot of it. And then one thing I didn't mention is the role of insurance in cyber insurance. So cyber insurance is becoming more and more common, and it's being driven partially by boards to help manage risk. It partially provides an external party that comes in and does an underwriting assessment in some manner. So it helps you benchmark. But I think it also has an impact on medical device companies who are selling medical devices that could have a problem. Federal Trade Commission, too, with the very large role. But it's a big issue. Oh, yes.
I don't know that I want to focus on moral hazard, but it seems that cyber is an area where you never really get ahead. You can't afford to fall behind, but you invest more and more resources into just maintaining what you already have. Do you see that having an effect on the rate of implementation? And some countries maybe recede back and letting the other countries take the lead in the investment, and then they reap the benefits later? A very broad question.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think it ties to the role of ICT in a country and in society. So I think every country faces a risk. If as Japan is moving towards Society 5.0, and there's Singapore's and Estonia's and us, that countries who aren't ICT oriented risk falling further behind and becoming less competitive. And so given that, and given how important cybersecurity is, I think it's imperative for the countries to be cybersecurity oriented too. What holds them back, though, is partially cost. So a lot of the technologies are very expensive and take some expertise. So the countries have a challenge both with the ICT they're doing, but also on the cost and how to go about the cybersecurity. But there's through Singapore, I think it's ITU in Singapore. There's a group who's has a focus on open source cybersecurity tools. There's many, and they don't do everything, but they do some things. But there's a challenge of putting them together. But there's that challenge too. Many companies now have 30 or 40 technologies that sometimes which conflict, and so that some of the research now is in company initiatives are, they're using the phrase orchestrating cybersecurity technologies, so they're compatible.
I have one last question.
Okay.
The medical record, because it's not consolidated, several
Huh.
companies, and you have to have each hospital has a different
Yeah.
password. US is going to be eventually consolidated. What's your opinion?
Oh, I have an opinion. I don't think so. I don't think there's. I don't think I don't think there would be the national will that it would take to actually do that, given how we're organized and the role of the private sector and things like that. So I don't think. But it's a really fascinating question, though. The electronic medical record, the value of it is on the black market is much higher than a credit card. So credit card is relatively low. But medical record much higher, because if you steal someone's medical record, it'll be, you can put bills through on it. It'll be 6 months before it's caught. A credit card might be stopped the next day, but you can Medicaid or Medicare fraud or insurance fraud 6 months or a year. So it's much more valuable. One kind of note on that, in Virginia, 7 of the 10 largest hospitals have EPIC, the EPIC electronic medical record system, but they're for the most part on different versions, so they're not compatible amongst each other.
So please join me in thanking the speaker. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.